A burned-out tank, a non-commissioned mechanic, and an idea so insane it would change the course of the most important invasion in history. June 6, 1944, the coast of Normandy. The field seems to breathe smoke and iron. An M4 Sherman is hit dead on, chokes, spits fire, and dies in the middle of a stinking swamp. The crew jumps out in a hurry. Every delayed second is a cremation sentence. From the outside, what's left is just a useless hull, condemned, ready to become scrap. But for a grease-covered sergeant no one knew by name, it was different. It was a steel body waiting to be reborn. His name was Curtis G. Cullen, a mechanic who made the impossible seem routine. No officer's uniform, no diploma, no fame, just the look of someone who learned that war doesn't forgive those who follow the manual. While generals drew arrows on maps, Cullen observed what was really stalling the invasion. The enemy wasn't just the Wehrmacht, it was the soil of France itself. Normandy was a labyrinth of bocage, hedgerows raised by centuries of farmers. They weren't ordinary fences, they were walls of hardened earth and thick roots, covered in dense vegetation. Each enclosed field was a natural fortress. For the Germans, a perfect defensive line. For the Americans, an invisible prison. And worse, every attempt to advance turned into a trap. When a Sherman tried to climb the wall of vegetation, the front rose, and the belly, the most vulnerable point, was exposed. Half a second was all it took. On the other side, a German with a Panzerfaust waited in silence. A flash, a roar, and the tank became an oven. The advance that was supposed to reach the interior of France in days was stalled less than 6 kilometers from the beach. Every meter of ground cost blood, smoke, and men burning inside steel. The reports called it a tactical delay. For those inside, it was hell repeating field after field. Cullen, with his hands always dirty and his ears attentive, saw it all close up. He repaired tanks, but in truth he tried to understand their soul, where they hurt, where they died. And he asked the question no one dared. Why are we trying to climb the bocage? The tank dies when it climbs, so why climb? The answer was a complete inversion of military logic. If the tank died while climbing, then it should attack from below. Instead of acting like a mountaineer, act like a plow. Enter the base of the barrier, dig into the foot of the wall, chew through roots, and open a path horizontally. Keep the nose low, and the frontal armor, the strongest part, always facing the enemy. That way, the weak point would never be exposed. A simple, brutal, and brilliant idea. But there was an obstacle. The bocage was hard as concrete. No Sherman would break through it with a smooth front without shattering. Cullen grabbed an oil-stained notebook and started drawing. Angles, lines, teeth. He imagined a metallic jaw welded to the front of the tank. Steel teeth, angled downward, strong enough to cut roots and tear open the soil. It seemed like madness, and it was. But in war, mad ideas are sometimes the only ones that save lives. Where would the steel come from? From the beach itself. Normandy was still covered with Czech hedgehogs, anti-tank structures left by the Germans to rip apart landing craft. Thick, heavy steel, useless now, but perfect for recycling into killer teeth. Cullen requested a condemned tank, a cutting torch, and free access to the captured parts. He wanted to saw, weld, experiment. The captain looked at him in disbelief. "You're going to destroy an entire Sherman with this madness." Cullen replied calmly, "Worse than destroying is letting it die the same way tomorrow." For a moment, The line between insanity and genius blurred. And then came the improbable. The captain said yes. In 48 hours, the scrap field turned into a workshop of hope. Cullen cut the enemy's steel, sharpened edges until they looked like fangs, and started welding. The sparks lit up the Normandy night like steel fireworks. Soldiers approached curiously, whispering, "Has he gone crazy?" "No, he's trying to kill the bocage." The tank gained teeth and with them a nickname, the Rhino. Heavy, ugly, and stubborn, like the man who created it. When it was done, the result looked monstrous. The Sherman's front was covered by 4 angled blades held by irregular welds. No one knew if it would work or explode on the first impact. Cullen looked at the machine and thought, if this fails, we all die. But if it works, maybe Normandy will move again. The test would be at dawn. A mutilated tank, 4 improvised teeth, and an idea born of stubbornness. The air was heavy. The ground smelled of gunpowder and mud. The Rhino growled, ready to charge. Men bet cigarettes on the outcome. It'll break in the first meter. It'll open a path all the way to Paris. Cullen didn't respond. He just gripped the extinguished torch in his hands and said softly, like a prayer, "If steel has a soul, let it hold." The next morning, the sun rose over the tank with its teeth gleaming. The engine sound broke the silence. In seconds, it would be charging against the impossible, and no one, not even the mad mechanic, knew if, when the dust settled, there would be anything left intact to tell the tale. The Rhino wasn't born in a laboratory. It was born as a technical military crime, made in the dirty light of a dawn that smelled of burned oil and recent death. Curtis Cullen got everything he needed without actually having permission for anything. A damaged Sherman that still moved, an acetylene torch that should have been locked up, and free access to the German steel hedgehogs that had been erected to prevent American tanks from reaching the beach. Now, ironically, that same German steel would be used to cross France against the Germans. The hedgehog beams were cut into heavy segments, trimmed until they were sharp like industrial chisels. It wasn't a shovel. It wasn't a plow. It looked like the tooth of a prehistoric animal, fierce, made to tear and not to push. Every weld joint received double reinforcement because Cullen knew that on the first impact against a root buried for 100 years, any weakness would rip off half the tank's front and kill those inside like an inverted steel guillotine. He wasn't playing at engineering, he was betting living people. Fixing the teeth to the Sherman's front required absurd precision. If you attach them too high, exactly what was killing everyone in Normandy happens. The tank climbs, exposes its belly, and dies burned. If too low, the nose buries, and the vehicle dies stuck before even entering combat, becoming a stationary target. It was geometry, mass distribution, raw physics, done without a computer, just with workshop memory and survival instinct. Cullen positioned 4 large teeth, slightly angled downward, in a line that wouldn't make the tank climb the barrier, but bite its base. The Sherman lost its clean face and gained a kind of jaw. And that's when the soldier seeing it for the first time started pointing and laughing nervously. "That's not a tank anymore. That's a rhino." The nickname stuck immediately. Rhino. Rhino. Ugly. Thick. Direct. Perfect. But a nickname doesn't win wars. What would, or kill everyone, was the first impact. The test couldn't be theoretical. There was no simulation. It either worked or someone would die quickly, and the army would order to forget it ever happened. They chose a real hedgerow, not a pile of dirt set up for training. A thick embankment, roots the size of human fists, old stone mixed in the base, that kind of rural wall that wasn't born in months but in centuries. Several officers came to watch, not because they believed, but because if it went wrong,
Someone important needed to know exactly who to blame in the report. The crew that agreed to operate the Rhino that day did so with the kind of calm that outsiders call courage, but insiders know is just accepting you might die and going on anyway.
When the men entered the hull and lowered the hatches, a strange silence took the line. It was the kind of silence that always exists when no one has any idea what will happen next, because that had never happened before in human history. Cullen stayed outside. He wasn't inside the tank, he was on the side of the officers, gripping his own helmet too hard, as if that could stop guilt from piercing him if everything failed. The Sherman's engine growled heavily. The smell of diesel and wet mud filled the air. And then came the order to advance. The tank started moving, not slowly, not testing the ground. It was launched with decision, like a bull lowering its head and delivering all its weight without asking permission. The impact sounded like compressed thunder. Earth exploded backward in chunks, roots broke with the sound of dry bone, stones flew in shards. For an eternal second, the Rhino was stuck in the green wall, motionless, buried, tooth first. Everyone held their breath. There were two possible futures. Either the entire front would tear off and become instant scrap, throwing those men back in a wave of broken metal, or it would break through. And then something almost impossible happened. The tank started advancing again, not climbing, not raising its nose, but opening a path horizontally, tearing the bocage at the base like opening a zipper of mud and root. This was new. No one had seen this. The vulnerable belly never appeared. The frontal armor, the thickest and sloped part of the Sherman, stayed pointed at the enemy the whole time. The German ambush immediately lost its sense, because to hit the weak point, you need the tank to expose itself. It didn't. For the first time since the landing, an American armored vehicle crossed a Norman hedgerow and emerged on the other side, intact. Not on fire, not smoking like a furnace, not with the crew screaming in flames. On the other side of the barrier, the next field was open, and behind it the infantry started moving along using the tank's hull itself as a mobile shield. This wasn't just mobility, this was continuity, it was rhythm, it was breaking the stagnation that was silently killing the Allies. When the tank shut off its engine and the hatch opened, the men inside didn't come out as if they'd survived an irresponsible madness. They came out as if they'd just proven war could be bent. One of them shouted laughing, not from humor but from adrenaline dump. "Smoothest hedgerow crossing of the entire campaign." Another just sat down in the mud and started laughing alone, that laugh after a scare that almost turns to crying. The officers who had gone there ready to write a failure report now walked around touching the welds with their fingertips, measuring angles, asking technical questions they hadn't asked before because they didn't believe enough to ask. One still tried to maintain authority and said, "You're crazy, Cullen." And another, more honest, corrected, "Not crazy, necessary." And it was exactly in that instant that the idea stopped being a sergeant's hack and became war doctrine. The question changed. It was no longer, "Does this work?" The question now was, "How many can you make today?" Cullen, still covered in soot, answered with dangerous naturalness. With half a dozen good welders and captured steel, he could equip several Shermans a day. The response that came back was bigger than anything he'd imagined. Not several, dozens. This was no longer a successful test. This was about to become a direct order. Normandy was going to start spitting out tanks with fangs. The invasion of an entire nation was for the first time breathing again. And that was the point of no return, because from then on, no one saw a regular Sherman anymore. Everyone started seeing something else, a steel beast with its own teeth, an actual battering ram, a mechanical rhino capable of tearing down, alone, the wall that turned Normandy into a tank graveyard. Cullen understood this without anyone needing to say it.
That morning, with mud up to his ankles and the engine noise still echoing in his chest, he knew either the war changed now or Normandy would continue devouring men until no one was left to tell the story. The next morning, Normandy woke covered in fog and smoke. The wind blew the smell of burned oil and rotten mud. The Rhino was ready to leave myth and enter real war. The field ahead was a sequence of monstrous hedgerows, each thicker and older than the last. There, 3 armored companies had already died trying to pass. The terrain seemed cursed, cratered, dotted with tank carcasses, twisted track remnants, and melted helmets. The Rhino's mission was simple on paper and suicidal in practice. Cross that sector, open a passage, and break the siege, keeping the Americans trapped a few kilometers from the beach. If they failed, Normandy would swallow one more tank, and Cullen's idea would die with it. Cullen climbed onto the turret. The wind hit his face, and the diesel smell burned his nose. He wasn't part of the crew, but he was there because he knew that if something went wrong, he'd be the only one able to explain why the tank had exploded. Inside, driver Jake Mitchell gripped the wheel as if taming an iron bull. Gunner Tom Harrison slowly rotated the turret, and loader Danny Chen closed the ammo compartment with a dry snap. Everyone knew the first impact would define if the Rhino was genius or epitaph. The radio crackled. The captain's voice came clear. "Advance, and keep the nose low." Cullen repeated the order, lightly tapping the turret as if speaking to an animal. "Low, boy, low and straight." The tank moved. The tracks tore the mud, spitting chunks of soaked earth. The first hedgerow was less than 50 meters away, 3 meters high, roots like fists, intertwined trunks. It was a living wall. Mitchell shifted gears and accelerated. The Rhino roared. When it hit the barrier, the sound was more earthquake than collision. The impact shook everything. The turret vibrated, the metal groaned, the ground opened in deep furrows. For a moment it seemed the tank had stopped. Cullen held tight to the hatch, his whole body trembling. Inside no one breathed. Then slowly the Rhino started biting the soil. The improvised fangs sank into the base of the hedgerow, ripping out roots, stones, and centuries of resistance. The tank advanced without raising its nose, without exposing its belly. On the other side, a German machine gun team tried to react. Harrison was faster. He rotated the turret, aimed, and fired. The machine gun nest went silent in seconds. "It works!" shouted Danny, his voice echoing in the intercom. But there was no time to celebrate. The second hedgerow was already rising ahead. The tank didn't slow down. Bullets started raining, hitting the armor and ricocheting in sparks. Cullen felt the heat of the collisions on the metal, but the Rhino pressed on, tearing the bocage as if the soil itself had given up resisting. For the first time, the impossible yielded. Then came the final test. Ahead, behind the last hedgerow, the most feared roar of the war, a German Panther. Intelligence had warned, but hearing its engine was another thing. Cullen took a deep breath. "Visual contact, partially covered," said Harrison. "No lateral cover," warned Mitchell. "If we retreat, we die." Cullen looked ahead and replied, "Straight through. If we're going to die, let it be while crossing." The tank accelerated. The second impact was brutal. The ground vibrated as if the earth had a pulse. The fangs cut through the wall of roots and stone. The Rhino emerged on the other side with its main gun already pointed at the target. Harrison didn't wait for orders. He fired. The white flash filled the hatch. The shot pierced the Panther's flank, which started burning. For a second, no one moved. Then the Panther's crew came running out, throwing down their weapons, hands raised. Cullen climbed down from the hull slowly. The air smelled of victory and hot iron. Captain Morrison ran up to him, radio still crackling. "We just broke the entire German line," he said breathlessly. "What you did in 2 hours, we couldn't in 3 days." Cullen looked at the mud-covered tank, the fangs smoking, and replied, "We just made the tank stop dying where it shouldn't." In less than 24 hours, the news spread like fire. A modified tank had crossed hell and come out alive. The battalion radio turned to chaos. Commanders wanted to know what it was. "A Sherman with fangs," the operators said, half laughing, half incredulous. The name started spreading: Culin Hedge Cutter. General Bradley heard the report and ordered an investigation. Eisenhower received the summary and responded with the phrase that would seal the invention's fate: "Multiply this now." What was born from a torch, scrap, and desperation became a national priority. Entire workshops started cutting German steel, welding teeth onto new tanks, and replicating the design. Cullen was called to command. The officer looked at him seriously and said, "Sergeant, your invention is going to every armored unit in Normandy. From today, you personally supervise the modifications." He nodded, still covered in soot. He didn't respond like a hero, but like a mechanic who knows what needs to be done. Outside, the sound of torches started spreading along the entire coast. The war was being rewritten, with teeth. Normandy turned into a construction site of sparks. Where before the distant roar of cannons was heard, now the metallic hiss of torches echoed. It was the sound of an army reinventing itself by force. In every improvised camp, men who had never welded anything learned in hours to tame fire and iron. The smell was the same everywhere: burned oil, sweat, and hope. The Culin Hedge Cutter stopped being an experiment and became standard. Newly arrived Shermans from the port were lined up and received new, sharp, almost symbolic fangs. Every welded tooth was a declaration of independence from fear. And Curtis Cullen, the mad mechanic, walked among the tanks like a blacksmith among dragons. He carried a grease-stained notebook where he scribbled measurements, angles, and instructions. 15-degree angle, he repeated, marking the exact point with chalk. If you weld too high, the tank raises its nose and dies. If too low, it digs the ground and dies the same. Welders listened to him like they listened to a commander. Cullen didn't speak like an engineer, he spoke like a survivor. He taught the language of the machine, what it could withstand, what it feared, what it could do if someone just let it. When General Omar Bradley arrived in person to see what they were doing, he found more than a workshop. He found a hive of living steel, men shouting measurements, torches spitting blue light, tracks being tested under rain and mud. It was chaos, the kind of chaos that builds miracles. Bradley approached Cullen, who was bent over a chalk-marked hull checking alignment. "So you're the man who pulled my army out of the mud?" asked the general, half smiling, half incredulous. Cullen wiped the soot from his forehead and replied, "I guess so, sir. I just tried to make the tanks stop dying every time they climbed the wrong hill." Bradley looked around, observed the teeth welded to dozens of Shermans, the sound of the torches and the golden glow of sparks lighting the field. "Genius in simplicity, Sergeant," he said. "Too many tried to reinvent the wheel. You just changed the blade." That phrase became official praise. That same day, Cullen was recommended for the Legion of Merit. But as the rank grew, he only thought about the next tank. There was pride, of course, but also a silent unease. He saw each Rhino being loaded for the front and knew that behind the efficiency was the invisible price. What he created didn't just save Allied lives, it also made the war deadlier for the other side. At night he stared at the red-stained maps, seeing the American advance accelerate, and thought, how many died because it worked? That was the curse of war inventors. Every victory has a metallic taste. The unit's chaplain noticed the weight in his gaze and said, "God gave wisdom to those who fix what's broken, even if the world is too cracked to be fixed." Cullen didn't respond. He just closed the notebook and went to sleep with his hands smelling of iron.
But the fact was undeniable. The invasion's rhythm changed. Before, each field was an isolated battle. Now, with tanks opening continuous passages, the advance was a flow. German lines began crumbling like sand walls. American divisions moved in cadence.
Tank in front, infantry right behind, trucks and jeeps following the opened trails. Soldiers called the modified Shermans rhinos and swore they had a will of their own. "These beasts are hungry," they said laughing. "They devour everything between us and hell." Combat footage started circulating among officers. Tanks crossing hedgerows, walls, even entire buildings. Military press fell in love with the symbol. One correspondent wrote, "In the land where roots became traps, now they are steps." Cullen read these reports with strangeness. He never saw himself as a hero. Heroes, to him, were those who didn't come back. But the impact was impossible to deny. In weeks, the name Culin Hedge Cutter became synonymous with survival. General Eisenhower called the invention one of the most decisive advances in the European campaign. Command reports used unprecedented expressions, unprecedented tactical advances, drastic reduction in casualties. It was as if a forgotten gear had started turning again, and the war, at last, had regained its breath. Even with the success, Cullen remained obsessed with details. He spent hours in improvised workshops, reviewing welds, correcting alignments, guiding recruits. He knew a poorly welded tooth could break on impact and pierce the hull, killing the driver instantly. That's why he supervised everything personally. He slept little, ate less. In one of the camps, a reporter asked, "How did you come up with this idea?" Cullen, without taking his eyes off a weld being made, replied, "When you spend too much time fixing things others call scrap, you learn nothing is impossible. It just needs the right way to do it." That phrase would appear days later in American newspapers, accompanied by a photo of him holding a torch. The caption read, "The man who gave teeth to tanks." But war gave no time for vanity. The front kept swallowing kilometers of France, and with every meter conquered, more lives were spared. In silence, the non-commissioned mechanic had become one of the names that redefined World War II. He didn't command armies, didn't wear stars on his shoulders, but he had turned scrap into revolution. In that land, smelling of blood and mud, every welded tooth was a prayer for survival. And though Cullen never considered himself a hero, the entire army knew the truth. Without that mad mechanic, Normandy might have stayed stalled, burying men in the same ground that now saw them advance. When the torches finally went out and the engines began roaring deeper into French territory, Curtis Cullen realized something inside him had transformed too. The noise of tanks crossing destroyed villages no longer sounded like victory. It sounded like memory. The Culin Hedge Cutter had stopped being improvisation, now it came factory installed, born with the new Shermans crossing the Atlantic. The invention had stopped belonging to one man and become the world's. Cullen's name rarely appeared in dispatches. The technical term dominated. Hedge cutter, cold, impersonal, almost bureaucratic. But among the soldiers, respect was different. In the fields, mechanics whispered before starting the engine, "This one's a rhino from old Cullen." It was a prayer disguised as a joke. Cullen crossed France, training teams, reviewing tanks, supervising modifications. He saw liberated cities, and at the same time the trails of destruction following behind. The invention that opened the way for advance also opened wounds in the landscape. Cut hedgerows, felled trees, houses reduced to rubble. He knew every advance meant defeat elsewhere. On silent nights, he noted in the same notebook where he'd sketched the first design, "Every tool that cuts to open a path also cuts what it shouldn't." War had taught him a bitter truth, that creating something capable of saving lives is inevitably creating something capable of taking lives. Even so, his invention's impact was undeniable. During the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, the rhinos didn't just tear hedgerows but pushed trees, destroyed cars, even burned German tanks blocking roads. The Culin Hedge Cutter had stopped being an idea. It was a survival philosophy. Soldiers joked that the tanks were hungry, devouring whatever stood in the way. What started as a hack had become a symbol of adaptation. The lesson was simple and powerful. The impossible is only impossible until someone decides to weld teeth onto it. But the personal price started appearing when silence returned. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the world celebrated with shouts, flags, and champagne. Cullen sat watching men party on now immobile, rusting tanks. The sound of laughter mixed with the cold wind blowing through the fields he'd helped liberate. He looked at the rust-covered metal fangs and thought, "This is what got us here, but how many were left behind?" He returned home months later to New Jersey, carrying medals in a crumpled envelope. He never hung them up. When called a hero, he just smiled and said, "Heroes are the ones who didn't come back." Civilian life welcomed him as if nothing had happened. Cullen opened a small garage and went back to fixing trucks and tractors, exactly as before the war. When a journalist insisted on interviewing him, he replied, "I just did what any mechanic would if he saw a problem." Decades later, in a short interview, he'd say a phrase that summed up his philosophy. "I wasn't special. I just saw something that needed doing, and the Army let me try." No pride, no grandeur, just the calm voice of someone who understood the greatest revolutions are born from the insistence of those who refuse to accept can't be done. Cullen died in 1963. His obituary was simple, almost anonymous. Curtis G. Cullen, mechanic and World War II veteran. No mention of the invention that changed the war's course. No line about the tank with teeth that freed Normandy from its own soil. But in museums among restored machines and the smell of rust, there are Sherman tanks on display with rusted teeth on the front. A small plaque explains what they were, how they worked, and who created them. Almost no one reads it. Visitors pass quickly, as if it were just another curiosity. But sometimes someone stops in front of the metal and asks softly, "How did no one think of this before?" And in that instant, without sound, it's as if Cullen answers from the depths of time, because no one listened to the mechanic. Cullen's true legacy isn't just the steel that survived the war, it's the invisible lesson he left for all who dream of changing something. Genius doesn't live in offices, it lives in grease, in improvisation, in the courage to test the absurd. His story proves you don't need a general's uniform to change a war's destiny, just a different look and a lit torch. Normandy was liberated by generals, yes, but also by a man who saw power in scrap. A man who understood the difference between a wall and a path is the right angle and the will to cross it. Today, in the green fields of France, the hedgerows have grown back. The wind blows gently, as if the earth had forgotten what it saw. But the echo of the tracks still lives there, under the ground. The echo of a tank with fangs and a mechanic who defied the impossible. Great revolutions aren't born from manuals. They're born from the stubbornness of an ordinary man who decides the impossible isn't permanent. And Curtis Cullen, the mad mechanic, was exactly that. A man who looked death in the face, saw a problem, and instead of running, welded teeth onto it.